Chapter 1, Route 23 and the Roots of Addiction. Terry and Louise Crandall never should have had children. It's a tough thing for me to admit, as I am the sole progeny of their brief and turbulent marriage, but that is the truth. Terry Crandall, my dad, was 19. He had just finished his freshman year at Ohio State University and was home working with his dad in the family business. Louise, my mom, was 16 and still in high school. They met at a local swimming hole, a common gathering place for Midwest kids who don't have ocean beaches to go to. She was blonde and pretty. He was blonde and handsome. A real all-American couple from the heartland, or so it appeared. I suspect in retrospect, Louise Schwab was looking for someone to rescue her, and Dad came along just at the right time. Her own father, Richard Schwab, was a real cold fish, a disciplinarian. Years later, as a child going with my dad to visit his wife's parents, I spilled some milk in my grandfather's presence at the dinner table. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, like he wanted to kill me. On the way home that night, I told my dad I never wanted to go there again. We didn't. Terry and Louise started getting hot and heavy at the quarry. So much so that Terry decided against returning to Ohio State University, the first of many questionable decisions he was making back then. After 3 years of dating, they decided it was time to get married. That's the official version, at least. The truth is, she'd been shacking up with him and had become pregnant with me, so they had to get hitched, or old Grandpa Schwab would have come after my dad with a shotgun. It was not an auspicious way to start a marriage. My mom had a wild streak, not surprising considering their whole generation was going wild. This was the 1960s, and they were both right in the middle of it. Dad smoked some pot, but rarely drank. That didn't stop Mom. In addition to smoking weed and drinking heavily, she did coke, took speed, and eventually became addicted to heroin. She was shooting up, not only in the little house that she and Terry moved into, but in her dad's house as well. Now that took some cojones. To be fixing in her bedroom while old disciplinarian Dad was lurking around in the living room, looking for something to piss him off. On top of this, she had a kid to take care of. I was born on December 12th, 1966. Mom was 19, Dad 22. The first 2 years went well, but the wheels started to come off the baby buggy when Louise wanted to party once in a while with her single friends. Being the 60s, those old friends introduced her to some new friends: marijuana, LSD, mescaline and speed, and eventually heroin, to which she soon became addicted. The more time she spent with her new friends, the less time she wanted to stay married. I don't think my dad realized how far things had gotten so quickly until the time he came home to find a dealer in the house, angry over having not been paid, waving a gun around and threatening to shoot both his wife and baby son. Terry calmed the guy down and gave him some money, and he left. But that was the breaking point. Louise could no longer hide her addiction or the fact that she had made yet another friend, this one male, and fallen in love with him. Terry and Louise were headed for Splitsville. Terry got custody of me until she could get clean. She tried, but I don't think she ever really did. Besides, she was hot and heavy with Loverboy. Pregnant, apparently, a smart move considering that she couldn't even take care of one kid and one man, let alone two of each. My dad, who wanted his wife to regain control of her life and come back home, tried to support her. There was talk of her getting an abortion, but she was afraid. A friend of hers had died while getting one. Then, the breaking point. Late in the summer of 1970, her boyfriend, I don't even know his name, was killed in a car accident. We don't know for sure, but we figure that Louise must have snapped over this. She was dealing with a lot of conflicting emotions about taking care of me, about her failed relationship, about her family, about being pregnant, about her drug use, and about her feelings for this guy, and his death must have put her over the edge. About a week later, on the night of September 23rd, 1970, she got into her black 1969 Bonneville. It had rained that day, but the roads weren't wet by the time she was out, which was late at night. She was headed out on Route 23, the road between Ohio and Michigan. Right on the state line, she crashed into a concrete abutment. No one saw her. There was no one else on the stretch of road at that time. Based on the autopsy, she wasn't intoxicated at the time. My mom's death was ruled a suicide, the first vehicular suicide in Ohio State history. Louise never wanted a big funeral, so I'm told, but her parents did. And at the end of it, old Grandpa Swab handed my dad the bill. Guess he figured he knew who to blame for her death. Couldn't be any number of factors. No, it was all Terry's fault. Louise was gone, her unborn child was gone, and before long, so was her family. Grandpa Swab died a few years later. Louise's sister died of diabetes that was not helped by her obesity, which she refused to do anything about. Her brother, apparently a huge acid head during his days at OSU, also committed suicide. The only ones left were another sister, whom we lost track of, and my grandmother Swab, who retired to Florida after her husband's death. When I showed up at her door in Florida in 1985, she spoke to me for 15 or 20 minutes and then politely asked me to leave. In a sense, I don't blame her. I was probably a reminder of a terrible tragedy in her life, the loss of her daughter. She chose to erase me from her life the way you might delete an unwanted or unpleasant email today. In retrospect, the fact that both my mother and her brother had drug problems should have been a huge, red flashing warning signal in the rear view window of my life. But at the time, no one thought about that. They, Terry, her parents, the rest of our family and friends, wanted to put it all behind them as quickly as possible. And so Louise ceased to exist, in memory, as well as in substance, written out of our history books, like some non-person in Soviet Russia for the next decade. In the years since, I've met a lot of addicts who have come from family situations like mine, and much worse. Abusive parents, absent parents, suicidal parents, screwball parents. I've also met addicts who've come from perfectly normal homes. Either way, at some point what your parents did or didn't do ceases to be an excuse for your drug addiction or alcoholism, or for any other behavior in your life for that matter. That said, it would be foolish to think that having a mother I don't remember, a mother who was addicted to drugs, a mother who committed suicide, didn't have an effect on me. It most surely did. But it wasn't the only reason I became an addict. To fully understand Terry and Louise Crandall, to understand me and everything that happened afterward, you have to understand Sylvania. This is the town where Mom and Dad grew up and met. This is the town where I was born and raised hell, and it's where I still choose to live. Let me give you a little tour. Sylvania is a suburb of Toledo, in the northwestern corner of Ohio, just a few miles from the Michigan border. The closest major city is Detroit, 60 miles to the north. The town was founded in 1836 by Judge William Wilson and a General David White, who supposedly earned the rank of general for his heroics in the War of 1812. The local histories emphasize the supposedly part. When the two men were deciding what to call the little settlement in the deep woods of the Maumee Valley, White said he wanted to name it for himself, Whiteford. My feeling? This guy must have been a bit of a bullshit artist, a creative con man. You probably had to be one in those days to survive on the frontier. And I think during my drug years, when I was lying to everyone in order to get what I needed to live, I was carrying on a proud local tradition. Fortunately, Judge Wilson must have read the riot act to the general, and the town was eventually named the way he wanted it, Sylvania. From the Latin Sylvanus, or forest, is a pretty name and appropriate. Located at the junction of two creeks, 10 Mile Creek, which I love this, is actually 30 miles long, and Ottawa Creek. The land was heavily forested, mostly with hardwoods such as oak, walnut, elm, and ash. The forests of the early times were dense and dangerous, wrote one local historian. Possibly this is one of the reasons Sylvania was located at the junction of the two creeks. There were Indians here. The Indian Wars of early America, in fact, were fought all along the Maumee River Valley. Massacres and counter-massacres for almost half a century. The woods in Sylvania were rich in game, which attracted roving bands of Huron and Chippewa. Two of the camping grounds were later the site of local golf courses, another reminder of who won that war. The railroad arrived in Sylvania a year or so after its founding, and with it came industry. Soon there were sawmills, a tannery, a barrel stave factory, grist mills, livery stables, and other small industries serving the town. In the years prior to the Civil War, Sylvania became a stop on the Underground Railroad, ferrying escaped slaves from the South to Canada. Not surprisingly, Sylvania was staunchly pro-Union when the Civil War broke out. A total of 102 men from the town served in the Union Army. 26. 1 out of 4 who served were killed. This is Sylvania, a hard-working, flag-waving town with a few secrets. In 1961, Sylvania was officially given city status. Although the Chamber of Commerce brochures now claim a population of 46,000, the city center itself is about 17,500. And it still feels more like a town to me than a city. If you can judge by the number of churches, 30, it's a devout community. And if you count the number of schools, 2 senior and 3 junior high schools, 7 elementary schools, 5 private schools, and Lord's College, a 4-year private liberal arts college, you have to surmise that it's a city that cares about education. Above all, Sylvania, like so many similar Midwest communities, takes pride in being a family place. A great place to live and raise a family, says the Chamber of Commerce. The school system, parks, recreation, heritage, museum, bike paths, and fine neighborhoods all make it a balanced community. When I hear that stuff, I'm tempted to say there is a chemical imbalance beneath it all. The truth is, Sylvania really does live up to much of what the town boosters make it out to be. The taxes are low, the cost of living moderate, the service is good. These days, we are mostly a bedroom community for Toledo, where many residents commute to work for Dana, Libby Glass, Jeep, all of which have headquarters there. So in many ways, we are a prototypical American suburb. It is indeed a great place to raise a family, which is why my wife and I are doing exactly that. Still, understanding my addiction, or anybody's addiction in this country, requires recognition that drugs and alcohol are not confined to the so-called lower classes. Sylvania is most definitely not Compton or the South Bronx, but just because the paychecks are fat and the lawn's lush, just because no one's ever thought to shoot an episode of Cops in Sylvania, doesn't mean the place is immune to the misery of drugs and alcohol. It's here, just like it's everywhere in this country. Thinking that it can't happen here not only unfairly stereotypes every inner-city person as a drug addict, but also fails to get to the roots of the problem, which are complex. Even today, there are many in Sylvania who don't like to admit this stuff went on and goes on. I hear this from some city officials and community leaders who simply deny there is a problem. Rather, they think I was the problem. Their attitude is, Todd was bad, Sylvania wasn't. Even today, my old high school won't let me come speak, because in all my other talks to schools all over the country, I reference the fact I started doing drugs while I was there. That's not to say Northview High was the reason I became an addict. However, like a lot of other schools and communities in this country, they are in serious denial. Hey, I was a problem. I was bad. Horrible, in fact. But those drugs didn't come out of a vacuum. I didn't travel to Detroit to get them, at least not at first. They were here. They are here. And like alcohol, when those get into the wrong hands, the hands of an addict, you've got trouble. No matter where you are. No matter who your parents are. For about a year, my dad and I lived together, while Louise had moved away to wrestle with her demons. I have no recollection of a sense of loss, or wondering where my mother had gone during this period. I do, however, remember getting clocked in the head with the removable seat of one of those big wheels by the kid next door, Casey Korn, and how honored I felt when I was invited to another neighborhood kid, Kyle McHugh, to swim in his family's backyard pool. Quite a prestigious thing in Sylvania in those days. I also recall there was a large bush on our cul-de-sac, and at one point a huge hornet's nest had been built on the top. This thing was massive, and the kids in the neighborhood set out to destroy it. I remember getting hold of my dad's garden hose, pulling it outside on the street, and blasting the nest full of water. I'd say this was an early sign of my destructive nature, except for the fact an older kid outdid me. This guy shot flaming arrows at the thing, like in some medieval siege, and he succeeded in setting it ablaze. Come to think of it, I wonder where that kid ended up. In December 1972, 2 years and 3 months after my mom committed suicide, we moved into a 2-story, 3-bedroom colonial house that Dad had built for us in the then-fashionable Grove Bell neighborhood of Sylvania. The house was, and is, a warm, comfortable place overlooking the misnamed 10 Mile Creek. When we moved in there, after Louise's death, there were woods surrounding us. I remember playing on 2 towering mounds of dirt while the house was being built. When we moved in, there were fields and woods all around us. Now it's all developed. Despite having other kids around in the neighborhood and in school, I felt a sense of isolation and emptiness during much of my childhood. This was only relieved on weekends when I got to travel across town to my grandmother's house. It was only 1.5 miles, but to me it felt like another country. Lillian Ward Crandall, or Granny, as I've called her since I could first talk, is a tough, strong woman now 89 years old. Granny was born in 1916, 6 weeks after her father died. Her mother died when she was 11, and Lillian went to live with kindly uncles and aunts. They were poor farmers in central Ohio, reduced to eating the crops they grew as the Depression set in. Eventually, Lillian married and had 2 sons, my Uncle Bill, born in 1942, and my dad Terry, 2 years later. She came from a poor but loving family. They endured a lot, as did so many people of that era, and she has been the rock of my life. Granny filled in for my mom and supplemented the role of my stepmom as best she could. Out on her spacious, green backyard, also overlooking 10 Mile Creek, the world seemed a different place. I remember playing with my Tonka trucks in her basement, building an igloo on her snow-covered front lawn one winter's day, helping her collect acorns and buckeyes, and talking as she knitted. At Granny's, I was, and still am, safe, understood, and always loved. Another woman entered my life at this point. My dad had met Cindy Duvall while she was working in a local drugstore, not long after Louise died. They were married in September 1972. The fact that Terry and Cindy have now been together for 33 years would suggest that she was the right woman for Dad, but for me, she was a disaster. Not because of who she is, but because of who I was becoming. Cindy tried to love me like a son, but I never really allowed her to. And when my half-brother Jason came along in 1974, that sealed it. This was not my real family, as far as I was concerned, even at age 8. Of course, my attitude was wrong and hurtful. And while I would use my sense of isolation from my father's second family as another excuse later, it was not really the case. I chose to be isolated. In fact, I allowed myself to piss everything away. Ultimately, I'm convinced that being an addict comes down to your individual makeup. Heredity plays a role, circumstances can make it less or more likely, but bottom line, it's you, my friend, the kind of person you are, and the choices that you and you alone make that will determine which way you go. What kind of person was I becoming? Signs of tenacity were evident early. Although I don't remember it, I have seen pictures and heard my dad describe my efforts to ride an adult-sized bicycle at age 3. There I am, a little blonde-haired kid in bare feet and no helmet. I'd never let my 4-year-old son do this today. Standing up and somehow managing to push the bike essentially by jumping from one pedal to the next. This has been pointed to by my dad as evidence of the determination and strong will that would later bring me close to ruin and then eventually save my life. I was also becoming a force to be reckoned with among the elementary school crowd. I organized bike races on the block, which I'd promote by distributing flyers that I'd drawn at home with crayons around the neighborhood. I won most of these races, in part because of the fierce competitiveness and refusal to lose. Kind of humorous when you consider what a loser I became. I was a leader in the Grove Bell neighborhood, and often I led in the wrong direction. When we got tired of racing our bikes, for example, I would lead the kids around the neighborhood after dinner and knock over all the garbage cans set up for trash collection. At holiday time, we'd do the same thing with Christmas lights. We'd ride by and kick or smash them with a baseball bat. Even more ominous signs of my character development manifested themselves in an episode that I've never told anyone until now. In the woods near our house, one of the neighborhood children and I once found an old fort that some older kids had built. It was some setup. There was carpeting on the floor that had been dug into the ground, surrounded by a wall and roof made of plywood and logs. There was even a door and windows. Had I stumbled on this thing 10 years later, I might have decided to move in. But at that time, at age 6 or 7, we decided to set it on fire. Using matches from a pack we swiped from home, we lit up some old papers we found inside the fort and threw them on the rug. We thought it was a cool idea, but then it got out of control. As the fire spread from the structure to nearby trees and bushes, We ended up running home with the thing in full blaze behind us. Soon we heard the sound of fire engines screaming into our neighborhood. Fortunately, the fire was put out before it could spread too far. Also, thankfully, we were never caught by either the authorities or the teenagers who had built that elaborate shack. Still, that little exercise in pyromania was a hint of the destructive nature I had inside me, an instinct that I would eventually channel in another direction, right back at myself. One day, a girl in my school came up to me when I was standing around with a bunch of other kids and said, "Todd's mother jumped off a bridge and killed herself." As I'd been told the story, my mom had been killed in a car accident. I cursed her out for lying, but inside the curiosity was growing. On Christmas Eve, when I was in 3rd grade, around 1974, we were at Granny's house. I went to use her bathroom and noticed a letter that had accidentally been left out on the counter. I recognized my dad's handwriting. It was explaining to my grandmother what happened that night on Route 23. To this day, I'm not sure why he needed to write this down when he could have just told her. Maybe it was too hard to verbalize. Anyway, I read his account of what happened to Louise and saw the word suicide. I'm not sure if I knew what it meant, but I pieced it all together. My mom had killed herself. When I put the letter down, I remember feeling a sense of satisfaction that the little bitch who taunted me in school had been wrong. My mom didn't jump off a bridge. She drove into one. And I certainly wasn't traumatized, at least initially. As I recall, finding the letter was the second most impressive thing to me that Christmas. My life-size Wile E. Coyote stuffed animal, which was about the same size as I was way more interesting. Psychologists might say that I sublimated or buried the memory of that traumatic discovery that night. It would slowly gnaw its way through my soul over the next few years. Now I knew the truth about Louise and Terry Crandall. Now I knew that I was a child of a mother who had chosen to kill herself rather than live with me.